everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of the 1973 podcast. I am so ecstatic to be sitting here with somebody that I'm so happy to have on the show. I'm going to go on a limb and say part of the greatest hockey announce team of all time, Mr. Bill Clement, Stanley Cup champion, Philadelphia Flyers. In my house, a legend. I got a story about that. We'll get to it later on. So happy to have you, Mr. Clement. I know you want me to call you Bill, but I'm so respectful of you coming on. I'm so happy to have you. And
Well, first of all, you it's not about respect, it's about age. I feel old enough most days as it is without being called Mr. Clement. Mr. Clement, as Eddie Olczyk always said, when somebody would call him Ed, he'd say, Ed was my dad. Okay, I'm Eddie. So I'm Bill or Billy C or whatever you want to call me.
so I always start off by asking everybody how their hockey journey started as a kid, and were you a hockey fan growing up?
Yeah, I was a huge fan. When I grew up 2 blocks from Guy Lafleur in a little town called Thurso, Quebec, 2,500 people in a paper mill town. And we only got one game a week on TV. Hell, I think until I was 10 years old, we only had one station, that we could get. There was no cable. So I loved the Toronto Maple Leafs and was with them every step of the way in their 1967, their last Stanley Cup. And my brother liked red, so he cheered for Montreal. But I grew up in this little town and was a huge hockey fan. But it's really interesting because I was raised English Protestant and went to a tiny little school with only 3 rooms, and 99% of the town was French Catholic. And the English kids, mostly by virtue, I guess, of religion, were never invited to try out for the town team. So I just played on a naturally frozen little rink behind our little English school. And I didn't start playing organized hockey till I was 12. And by the time I was the man that came, the brother of the Catholic order that came to run the big Catholic school, said, where are the Protestant? Where are the English kids? And luckily, that's when they started reaching out to the little English school and saying, if anybody wants to try out, for a little local town league. So I said, hell yeah. And my mom and dad were supportive. So I started playing really organized. I made a team right away. And I actually was scouted when I was 15 by the Chicago Blackhawks and made a team in the Quebec League. They had a direct sponsored team, the Sorel Blackhawks. So I started playing organized hockey when I was 12. And by the time I was 15, I was playing major junior A hockey. I was, when I think back at it, and the evolution of my hockey career launched pretty quickly, So, but I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. I mean, my brother and I but he was 3 years younger than me, but he could always shoot harder than me. And we'd shoot with pucks, tennis balls, whatever on the garage door. And we had white shingles all around it. And with black paper behind the shingles. And we just beat the shit out of the front of our house. And my poor mom, she said, look at our home. Look what you're doing to my home. My dad said, that's okay. When he's 14, I'm going to bring him a bundle of shingles and he can repair all of the shingles in the front. Sure enough, the day I turned 14, there was the bundle of shingles and they were hard to replace. But so, like a lot of players, most players, my story is just falling in love with the sport, playing it as hard as I could and letting the rest take care of itself. When people have always said to me, how did you choose hockey? I said, I didn't. It chose me, right? I was playing every sport that I could. I loved, I mean, whatever it was. We had such a small town. There was no organized baseball leagues or football leagues or anything, but there was hockey. I did play high school basketball and was probably a better basketball player once I started going to high school 15 miles away from our hometown. I was a better basketball player than I was a hockey player, but that didn't mean there were opportunities in the NBA for a 6'1" kid from Quebec. They didn't scout us up here, where I lived. Right now, I live on the side of a mountain in the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. So that's where I'm coming to you from. But that's how it started. Sort of a typical start to a kid's youth athletic career. And it just grew from there.
So we'll shoot to draft day just because we're in draft weekend. Everybody's talking about the Flyers picks and everything, but how did it feel getting drafted 18th overall by the Flyers? Were you even surprised that they took you?
So it was really funny. The draft was at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal. That's where it was held for a number of years. And there weren't that many players being drafted. There was only one player from the US in the NHL, and it was 99.9% Canadian. Now I think at last count there are 16 different countries represented. So it wasn't as if I was 18th overall out of 5,000 guys. The draft pool was small, but our owner is in Ottawa. I was the original captain of the Ottawa 67s in 1967. And Howard Darwin was our owner, and he was a wonderful man. And the guys that were graduating and eligible for the draft the year I was drafted, we were big guys. I was a little under 6'1" and weighed 187 pounds when I was 15 and 16. So I was same size by the time I was 19. And Peter Laframboise and Terry Murray, longtime NHL player and NHL coach, and Connie Forey. I think I was the smallest of the four of us. And Howard Darwin felt if the owners and the scouts that were at the draft could see how big we were, I have pretty big hands. They don't work the way they used to. They're a little gnarled right now. But he thought, we're only 2-hour drive from Montreal. We're going to take you guys to the draft. Wear a nice suit. We're going to put you up in a hotel and you're going to go to the draft that day. And it went from probably the most painful experience of my life waiting, like it seemed like forever, but when you're 18th overall, it's not that long a wait, right? And it went from one of the most tension-filled days of my life when I got up that morning and said, "Oh, geez, what's going to happen here? Where am I? Am I going to get drafted? If I am going to get drafted, where am I going to get drafted?" It's hard, boys. It's really hard. So it went from being one of the most stressful days to instant euphoria. When you hear your name picked, and the Flyers coach at the time, his name was Vic Stasiuk, and I got a picture of me. I wish I had it. I could show it to you. Me beaming, standing right beside with a big handshake of the Flyers coach. Of course, that was his last year. They fired him, and he never worked in the NHL again. Fred Shero came along, but that day of being drafted, and I didn't know who the Flyers had on their roster, really. No, my first thought was, I'm a center. Who do they have down the middle? Right? I wanted to evaluate my chances of making the team. So there were guys that I didn't know very well. Just in case this happens, guys, while we're talking, I'm going to mute my phone. Forgot before. So I looked at the players that they had down the middle, and I didn't even recognize some of the names. So I thought, well, okay, I got a pretty good chance. I ended up playing a year and a bit in the minors, but I figured at some point I'd be able to crack the Flyers roster, and I did, and it was fantastic. I remember you had to be 20 years old. The drinking age in Quebec was 20 years old, but I was 19 and I looked like I was 20. So went to have a couple of beers at a bar to celebrate, and it was just loaded with hockey people. So I got standing beside the Hall of Famer, legendary goaltender Glenn Hall, who played into his 40s. He was magnificent and one of the funniest guys. So I'm standing there. Here I am. I'm 19. I missed another year junior by 11 days because of where my birthday fell. So I'm standing beside Glenn Hall, and I remember saying to myself, "Holy shit, I'm standing here beside Glenn Hall." And at one point he said, "Billy, I work on a theory. My theory is this. My body only has so many saves in it. So why waste them in practice?" And I thought, he was so funny. He was so wonderful. So it was a fantastic day, the day I was drafted, and by Philadelphia. Who knows what would have taken, a lot of life is just timing. So I have these two cup rings that I'm really proud of. I don't usually wear them, sitting in my office, but because I was coming on with you guys, I thought it would be appropriate to wear these rings. So, if the Flyers had passed me over and I'd gone 19th to Oakland, what the hell, where would I be? Would I have ever won a Stanley Cup? So they said, "Wow, what?" I said, "It's like life, right place, right time."
They would have had
Now
to
you got
trade
to
for
make
you.
something of it, right? You got to do something with the opportunity, but still, right place, right time.
So, Bill, I'm going to ask you about your initial impression when you got to the Flyers. Your initial meeting with them. You're meeting the guys for the first time. What was your impression?
Well, the first time you were talking about my teammates or
Yeah.
players.
Oh yeah, we're just getting there. The whole experience that first
Yeah.
time.
So our training camp that first year was in Quebec City, and the Flyers owned the Quebec Aces of the American Hockey League. That was their farm team. So I got to know some of the Flyers players, but I didn't know anybody that was coming to that training camp. And I do remember that they had three shifts. There was the NHL shift, the AHL shift, and then the Eastern League shift. And I stayed after I was in the AHL practices, although I got to play a preseason game. But I remember watching not the ECHL, the Eastern Hockey League. I remember watching one of their shifts in training camp, and I said, "Oh man, if I get sent down to that shift, I'm going to quit." It was just brawl after brawl after brawl in training camp, and I ended up being assigned to the Quebec Aces. So I lived in Quebec, and I got to know some of my future teammates with the Flyers pretty well because Don Selesky and Dave Schultz and I were on that team together. We all turned pro together, and so was Bobby Taylor. So I got to know some guys by the time I got to Philadelphia. But it's it's really a challenge if you're not outgoing to a degree and you don't meet people easily and well. It's hard for young players, for a 19-year-old. And you just hope that you end up hooking on with a team that has some veterans that understand what it's like, to be 19 and kind of put their arms around you once in a while and include you in different functions and invite you over to dinner. And we had that in Quebec, although there were 11 rookies on that team in Quebec City. And that year, my first year as a pro was Guy Lafleur's last year of junior, and he was playing for the Quebec Ramparts. So we were playing out of the same building. I had played, 3 years with Guy. I was a hockey year older than him, so that's why I turned pro ahead of him. And his second last year junior, he got 101 goals in a season. His last year, he got 130. And our 11 rookies and our Quebec Aces, we went on a 9-game winning streak at one point in the middle of the season, and our attendance went up from 2,200 a game to almost 8,000. The building seated 11,000. Guy Lafleur packed that to the rafters every game, junior hockey, and our professional team struggled for attendance only because Guy was there. It was great. 14 feet of snow fell in Quebec City that year, pro, my first year pro. And the next year I went to training camp with the Flyers, and I led the team in scoring, and I got sent to the minors again. And I thought, well, what do I have to do here? Like, what's going on? And it was funny that because I started playing so late, I could really skate, and I was really tenacious, and I was really good in faceoffs. I was really big and strong. But I was always insecure with the puck because there were always guys, even when I was a 12-year-old starting to play, there were guys that, that could stick handle better than I could and shoot better than I could. So I remember so many coaches saying, you got to shoot sometimes. I'd be on a breakaway, look around for somebody to pass to. Like, what are you doing? So that year in Quebec City, the Flyers wanted me to, and playing in Ottawa was a good thing because I got lots of ice time, but we were an expansion team in the Ontario League. And that first year, we had a 54-game schedule. We won 5, tied 5, and lost 44. Not so good. But our coach, Bill Long, there was always a star player on the other team that, because we were an expansion team, he started with the first part of his plan in every game was eliminate the best scorer on the other team. So that was my job. And they were mostly centers, Gilbert Perreault, Marcel Dion, Dale Talon, you name it. Every team had a star player, and I was just a shadow. Said, follow him around. Don't let him touch the puck. When he gets off the ice and goes to the bench, you come to our bench. So it was another reason I never developed I didn't have the hands. I knew how to stop people from getting the puck, but I didn't know what to do with it when I got it. And that first year in Quebec City in the American League, the Flyers, they had told the coach, Eddie Bush, he doesn't kill penalties anymore. And I love penalty killing, loved it. They wouldn't let me kill any penalties. I played every power play. And I thought, well, this feels kind of foreign, but I led our team in scoring that first year in the American League. So it kind of worked out. And but that next year, when I was starting to get to know some of the Flyers players in training camp, I got sent to the minors again. The Flyers had drafted, they had two top 10 picks. One guy was named Larry Wright, and he had been the MVP in the Memorial Cup, the junior championship in Canada, and another player from the Quebec League named Pierre Plante. And they kept both of them right out of junior and sent me to the minors. And I thought, that doesn't sound very good to me. But I, like anything else, you have to take things in stride, remain positive, keep working on it. So our team moved from Quebec City to Richmond, Virginia, and living was easy in Richmond. It was great. I didn't mind it, although it wasn't what I had my sights set on. I did when I was growing up. Well, Don Cherry, and I have a book of sports quotes, the funniest sports quotes. And one of his quotes was, every night when I went to bed when I was a kid, I prayed to God to make me a professional hockey player. And he said, unfortunately, I forgot to specify the NHL, and I spent 22 years in the American League, you know? So playing in Richmond was fine. And I was leading our team in scoring again. And I found out this story years later. Flyers management, our GM, Keith Allen, and our director of player personnel, Marcel Pelletier, would call down every 2 days to find out what everybody was looking like. And they always asked how I was doing. And Eddie Bush would always say, nah, not ready. No, he's not doing it. And what I found out years later was that Eddie Bush, who coached against me in junior, he coached the Hamilton Red Wings. He had always wanted me on his team. He had tried to trade for me in Ottawa a number of times, and Ottawa wouldn't trade me. And then all of a sudden, he's coaching me in Quebec City, and he had me in Richmond. And Marcel Pelletier, the director of player personnel, told me this years later. He said, we'd call down because there was no video link. You couldn't just, nothing was being videotaped and sent back and forth. So Eddie kept saying, nah, he's not ready. He's not ready. So Keith Allen and on a Friday night came to Richmond, and Marcel and Keith watched us play. And I was on a plane the next morning to Detroit to join the Flyers. And I played my first NHL game that night after they came and watched me. They knew I was ready. And Eddie had been, feeding them stuff, misinformation. So I played in Detroit on that Saturday night. So I played in Richmond on the Friday night. I played with the Flyers against the Red Wings in the old Olympia in Detroit on Saturday night. And then we chartered back to Philadelphia, and I had to play a third game in 3 nights. And we played at home against the Montreal Canadiens. And I remember Ken Dryden was in goal. And we won 4-1. And I had a goal and an assist. And at that point, Larry Wright and Pierre Plante had combined for a goal and 2 assists in the first 20-some games of their pro careers. So they ended up getting sent down right away, and I never played another game in the minors. But what's interesting about that game is 2 things. The goal that I scored, I just about crossed the blue line. I was one-on-one with Jacques Laperriere, and I ripped a shot over Ken Dryden's glove that he didn't have a chance at all. And for 5 years, the Flyers fans waited for me to shoot a puck like that again. And, and I never could. I also got in a fight in that game and ragdolled a guy named Mark Tardif. And I still have video of that. And they also waited for that to happen again. And it never happened again. So it was like, wow, they thought they had the whole package, and little by little they realized, and I was just happy to be up. And two games later, I got another goal and an assist. So I had 2 goals and 2 assists my first 4 games in the NHL, and it was launched, And I never played. I was lucky. A lot of guys get called up, sent down, called up, sent down. That has to be really hard, but I never had to go through it. The first time I was called up was the only time I was called up, and I stayed, for my 11 years in the NHL.
Bill, I got to ask you that when you had made a joke about that fight and never having to do it again, you pretty much hit it spot on because that Broad Street Bullies team, and I like to put the Flyers team as a whole, but that group is so special to hockey fans, not even Flyers fans. It's just they've made documentaries about it. HBO did a fantastic documentary on it.
Yeah, they did, didn't they? Yeah, they
Oh,
don't. HBO doesn't make many mistakes.
yeah, that documentary was fantastic. They really captured it for people that don't even really like hockey, but are so enamored with that team.
Well,
Why?
wait just a second.
Yeah.
As loved as we were in Philadelphia, we were equally as hated everywhere else.
Well, that's what Joe Watson
Everywhere.
said.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
And I somebody said, "Did you fight a lot in the NHL?" And I looked at it. I think I had 11 fights. And I remember thinking, I got to have at least one a year to let other players know I'm willing. If I have to, I will. But I was the guy that my main function with the Broad Street Bullies was delivering the gloves to the penalty box for all the guys that did the fighting. Thanks,
I bet.
Bill. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yeah.
And if you watch the YouTube videos, you'll see that. It's
Oh
funny
yeah.
because you mentioned that because it seems like that was a thing.
But I got back to killing penalties in the NHL. The only time my statistically my best year, I had 5 shorthanded goals one year. I was the lead penalty killer up front along with the late Tim Ecclestone, who was a good friend. And it's the only time I played on any team, even when I was in Philadelphia, that our team percentage-wise led the NHL in penalty killing, the Atlanta Flames, when I was down there. So I got back to killing penalties when I was with the Flyers, who I played for before I went to Washington and Atlanta, and it was like I felt home again. Killing penalties. I just loved it, and because our team was such a rough and tumble team, I was never out of work. I mean, I had penalties to kill every game.
I got to ask you from a Flyers fan and for people that are going to watch this, what does that 2 years of Stanley Cups back to back mean to you?
I feel so lucky, so fortunate. As we chatted about just a few minutes ago, you never know where you're gonna end up. You sure never know if you're gonna have a guy like Bobby Clark on your team or a goaltender like Bernie Perrant. So the team was really well constructed. And the first year was we were long shots. We were not the favorites, not even close. And we went through a bitter 7-game series with the New York Rangers and beat them in game 7 in the Spectrum, and then had to take on Bobby Orr and the Boston Bruins and Phil Esposito and Johnny Busick and Ken Hodge and Wayne Cashman. And they had as many tough guys as we had. And it was like, okay, here we go, boys. And we hadn't won a game in Boston in 7 years, and we had to win one. We didn't have home ice advantage. We hadn't won a game in 31 consecutive games in Boston. And in game 1, we were tied going into the last minute. And with 22 seconds to go, big Ken Hodge, the winger, Moose DuPont was going back into the corner to pick up the puck. And we would have taken overtime, that one shot to win that game finally in Boston. And Moose got tackled, and there was no penalty called. And Wayne Cashman was right there to pick. He was sailing in behind Ken Hodge and Andre DuPont, and he picked up the puck and turned around. And I remember going, "Oh shit!" Bobby Orr was coming right down the middle across the blue line, and it was tape to tape bang, and he beat Bernie Perrant with a shot. So we lost game 1 with 22 seconds to go, and it was pretty hard because, oh man. So we went back to the hotel where we were staying at, and it was a country club hotel outside of Boston. I don't even remember where it was. As a player, you don't even care where you are. You know where the bus is, you know where your hotel room is, you know where the rink is, right? That's all you know. Where's the pregame meal? That's all you really needed to know. So we went back to the hotel. Freddie Shero, man, who was so far ahead of his time, he said, "Okay, guys, listen up. Tomorrow, we can all go down to Boston Garden. You guys can practice for an hour, or you can all play 9 holes of golf and turn your scorecards into me." I think, Freddie would always add a tail onto something that he would say, like, and turn your scorecards into me. Thinking back, it was probably to make sure we didn't end up in some gin mill just drinking beer or, drinking cocktails all day on our off day. And I've said, I had a speaking career for many years. I don't like the term motivational speaker because that to me means that somebody made you feel really good and 2 days later you had no idea what the hell he said. So I consider myself more of a human development presenter. I wanted to give people some information that would last. When a year later they say, "Oh, geez, this is what he was talking about." So, Freddie, turn your scorecards into me. So, in front of major audiences, I would often tell that story, and I'd say, "So we had the choice: going to practice or golfing." I said, "What do you think we voted to do?" And most of the people said, "You voted to practice. It's the Stanley Cup Finals, right? You got one day before the next game." I said, "No, we golfed." We all golfed. And it was years later that I said to Freddie, I said, "Freddie, I got to know this." He was in decline. And I went to see him. He was dying of cancer. And I said, "Can I ask you a question?" And he said, "Sure. Ask me anything you want." I said, "What the hell were you thinking that day that you let us go golfing instead of going to practice?" He said, "Look," he said, "I knew you guys were in shape. I knew you guys knew how to play. I knew we had a game plan. Our X's and O's were solid." He said, but I'd never coached a team that had as much that you guys loved each other and you really cared about each other. And I wanted you to relax and laugh with one another and have fun with one another. I mean, the truth is, and it's different today because the players make so much money and most of them have so many advisors and they're so wise. But back then, we were all kids trapped in men's bodies. And Freddie kind of knew that. And he wanted us to be able to just have fun. So we get to game two, and we're down by a goal going into the last minute of play. And Moose Dupont kind of glided into the top of the circle, and the puck came out to him. And with 51 seconds to go in game two, poetic justice was served, and Big Moose scored to tie it. And then Clarkie won it. Bobby Clark won it early in the first overtime period. And we had our win in Boston. We went on to win games 3 and 4 at home. And we went back to Boston for game 5, and we could have won the Stanley Cup on Boston ice, but we lost 5-1, and it could have been 10-1. We were horrible. And we went back to Philadelphia for game 6, and nobody spoke this, but we all knew. We all had to be thinking it. If we let this one slip away and have to go back to Boston for game 7, we're screwed. We hadn't won a game in 31 games. We already won one. You think we're going to win 2? So game 6 was so nerve-wracking because we had a 1-0 lead in the third period, and 1-0 against Phil Esposito and Bobby Orr seemed like it was a 0-goal lead. And I've told this to people many times, and it happened like with other teams. Depending on which side you are of this continuum of time, your perception of time is so different. If you're ahead by 1 goal and you've got 3 minutes left in the game, the 3 minutes seems like 3 hours. If you're behind by a goal and there's 3 minutes to go in a game, that 3 minutes goes by like it's 3 seconds. So that 1-0 lead, it seemed like an eternity. Like, when are we going to get out of this thing? And Bobby Orr took a penalty with 3 minutes to go. By the time he came out of the penalty box, he was done. We wore Bobby Orr out, and Joe Watson was Bobby Orr's best buddy. They played together in Boston, and Joe has told me many times, Bobby Orr told me that he had nothing left. He had nothing left. Freddie Shero's plan was to dump the puck into Bobby Orr's corner, give it to him. Like, I think some of our own players were going, "What? We want to give him, that's a turnover." But Freddie knew we knew how to forecheck, and he knew that if we could force Bobby Orr to pass the puck and then stay with him to eliminate him getting the puck back. So he had to work so hard to get back in the play, and Bobby Orr revolutionized the game. Definitely one of the 3 greatest players ever, ever, ever. And we just wore them down. And that's why Freddie was a genius in so many ways. The second year was a little different. The second cup was against Buffalo. What do you want to know about that one?
So before we leave Stanley Cup one, uh, Joe had mentioned a famous story about Freddie Sherrill with guaranteeing the win, almost in the paper as a quote, just to motivate, right? The guys,
Well, he said we already beat a team better than the Bruins.
right?
And I remember Freddie picked up the newspaper coming off the plane. I think we flew commercial back then, and Joe was walking beside him, and Joe's told me the story too, and he's told you guys the story. There's the headline: Flyers say they've already beat a better team than the Bruins. And Joe's, who the hell would say that? Why would anybody say that? Freddie, who said that? Freddie, I did. Yeah, he didn't want the Bruins to think that we were intimidated by them.
So when we were talking to Joe, you also had mentioned, and we're going to put a pause right here before we talk about Stanley Cup 2. He compares, and I brought it up to him, that Slapshot was based on you guys. Pretty much the vibe with the stories and the stuff that you can't really talk about, but you guys all know about the hockey chirps and the little games within a game and the little banter that goes on. He says we made him laugh when we brought that up to him, and he said, yeah, because he was telling funny Bernie Perrant stories, and one he's like, you got to edit this out, but I didn't edit it out, and it was hilarious, hilarious.
Yeah, that Eastern League that I told you about when I was watching that shift, my first pro camp, I said, if I get sent down to the Eastern League, I'm bailing. I'm out of here. I mean, they had 14 guys on each team. They played a 72 game schedule and we all traveled by bus from Hartford, Connecticut to Orlando, Florida, Jacksonville, Florida. And the brawls, it was wine, women, and song and brawls like all night long. Not to say that that didn't exist to a degree with us, but I give credit to the Eastern League teams for the creation of Slapshot. That's my story, and unless you put me under oath, that's all you're going to get.
Okay, so let's jump back to the Buffalo Sabres and Stanley Cup 2. I thought, do you think that the second year Flyers team was better than the first year Flyers team, from your opinion?
Yeah, I think we were better. Um, if only because Bobby Clark had Reggie Leach on his right side. And Cowboy Flett got 40 goals and was a good player, but Reggie was an elite scorer with a dangerous shot and a history playing with Bobby Clark and Flin Flon, Manitoba. So they played junior together. So in that regard, and Jimmy Watson, Joe's younger brother, it's so strange to me that I ended up playing with brothers that were 10 years apart in age. People say, yeah, they're probably a couple years apart, 10 years apart in age. And Jimmy was coming into his own the second year and was a really good player. So I think we were better the second year. And, you know, you, you can't control everything. That second year, three teams in the NHL ended up with 113 points. Us, the Buffalo Sabres, and the Montreal Canadiens. And Montreal always played well against us, man. And Buffalo always had Montreal's number. The French Connection line just loved playing in Quebec, playing in the Montreal Forum. Perrault, Gilbert Perrault, René Robert, Richard Martin, the French Connection. They were so good. And Buffalo did us a favor because they met Montreal and they eliminated Montreal. And you never know what would have happened. We were a better team. But boy, Montreal, what a team they had. So we were much happier facing the Buffalo Sabres than we were the Montreal Canadiens. It was only Buffalo's fifth year in the NHL, 1975. They came into the league in 1970, and they had never won a game in the Spectrum. And we had home ice in that series. And we all knew that if we played the way we can play, even if it took 7 games, we were going to win. And that we didn't have that same level of confidence the first year against the Bruins. And yeah, Buffalo, we won our first 2 games at home, and then we went to Buffalo and lost both games there. And one of them was the Fog Bowl. The video, if anybody's watching this, you got to see if you can find it on YouTube. The Buffalo Sabres Flyers Stanley Cup Finals 1975. There were so many weird things that happened, from fog. You remember that at all? Did you ever see any
I
video of that?
I do. I have it on VHS when the Flyers used to sell the VHS tapes. We used to buy
Yeah,
them every year. With the
right.
bat, Bernie Parent killed the bat or hit the bat.
Well, I'll show you. I'll tell you about the bat. But first of all, the fog. Game four went into overtime, and people sitting in the stands were looking through probably about 6 to 8 feet of fog because what didn't go all the way up to the ceiling. It was just over the ice. When you were on the ice, you couldn't see anybody on the other side of the ice. You couldn't make a rink wide pass. You didn't even know who the hell, if anybody, was there. And I remember in the fog, we went into overtime, and Rennie Robert came across the right blue line into our zone, and the you could hardly even see the puck with the replay of it. And he ripped a shot that found its way. Bernie didn't have much of a 5-hole, but it went right between his pads. And I remember Bernie just doing a pirouette. The exit to the locker room was right there by the goal. Bernie got scored on, off the ice. Okay, let's get on the plane, go back to Philadelphia. But during that game, that same series, and it wasn't that game, was the bat, right? This bat was Rick McLeish was our centerman that was out there for a face-off, and Jimmy Lorentz was facing off against him for the Sabres. And this bat kind of dive bombing, and the linesman was there, and the other players were going, what is going on here? There's a bat that's attacking us. I mean, it was really flying in and out of the players that were there. Finally, Jimmy Lorentz, it came close. Jimmy Lorentz goes, knocked it out of the air, killed it, and knocked it onto the ice. And then the big question was, well, what are we going to do with it? Right? The refs, bare hands, they didn't want to pick it up. Everybody's looking around. Finally, Rick McLeish, nothing fazed Ricky McLeish. He just looks over, down at it, picks it up in his glove, hockey glove. He still got his gloves on, goes over the penalty box, throws it in the penalty box, and away we go. A little sidebar on that is that poor Jimmy Lorentz got hate mail from animal rights people for years, and it's like, really? And to each his own, it's a democracy. You can love what you love and hate what you hate. But yeah, the bat story there were so many bizarre things. When the fog, though, was such an interesting phenomenon. The Buffalo Auditorium had no air conditioning. And it was the end of May, and it was a very early hot summer. So it was painful to play in that much humidity, no air conditioning. So it was hard. So what was always done in the NHL, if there was a little bit of fog in some of the older buildings that didn't have air conditioning, they get both teams to come out and skate around real fast, almost like the first 2 or 3 laps of a warm-up. So they had us do that. And the ice at the Buffalo Odd was horrible, chipped easily, full of ruts. So we were going behind our net. And finally, Joe Watson and Eddie Van Im said, "Hey, what the hell? You're killing the ice behind our net. We're never going to be able to get the puck out of here, if they dump it in behind our net." So they said, and the same thing was going on at the Sabres end. They said, "Skate in front of the net." So they were going through the crease, and Bernie Perras said, "Whoa, hey, wait a minute. Don't go there. Hey, that's my crease. I'm not going to be able to control the puck. Hey, come on, you guy." So both teams went and sat back on our bench and said, "This is your problem, NHL. You got to fix this." And that's when they got sheets on these big bamboo poles and had kids put skates on and come out like sailboats sailing around to lift the fog. Like, seriously? I still can't believe shit like that happened, and that we were involved in it. It was so crazy. It was a crazy series. And well, we ended up winning in Buffalo on Buffalo ice, which was completely different than winning at home. And in some ways, more enjoyable. That first cup when we won, and Dave Schultz and I, you can see us on some of the video. People poured over the glass, the short glass on the side, and there were hundreds of people on the ice. We couldn't even find out where the cup was. Clarkie and Bernie had it, and we're skating around, and these kids, most of them were like teenagers, drunk, on the ice, and they come up, they grab you. We did it, and I remember saying to myself, "What's this we shit?" I don't, I, I don't remember you. I don't remember you guys sitting on the bench beside me. We did it, but that was just the nature of the Flyers fans, and they're the best in the world. Every fandom, associates, especially with champions. So I remember we were trying to catch up to where the cup was. We didn't even know where it was. And there are shots of Schultz and me just grabbing people by the back of their collars and throwing them down onto the ice so we could, get out of the way. So the next year, it was obviously not that going on the ice in Buffalo. And there were a couple of guys had their dads there, and the media was let into our locker room. But we got to spend time with each other. And we chartered home, and the cup was on the plane with us going back. So it was it was an easier time for us to connect. And when people say, what's the number one emotion that you had when you won? Well, first of all, the first year was like disbelief. Like, are we really here? Did this really happen? And the second year, it was different. But the emotion that I felt, I loved my teammates. We really cared about each other. And the predominant emotion was just loving one another. And Freddie was right. We cared so much about one another. It was one of the keys to us winning it all. You have to. And there were no cliques. I think one of the reasons we beat the Bruins that first year, I think our bottom half of our roster played better than the bottom half of their roster. And I think only because our leaders, like Bobby Clark and Ed Van Imp and Joe Watson, they all helped us feel that we were important to the outcome. And I'm not sure that happened in Boston. There seemed to be the elite 4 or 5 with Ken Hodge and Cashman and Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito. I may be wrong, but I could sense that when our bottom 6 to 8 players were called upon, we were usually able to execute. So, right place at right time again.
So, Bill, before we move on to the trade, and I want Ed and Tom to at least get in a couple Broad Street Bullies questions. Tom, you got a Flyers related question for Bill?
Yeah,
Yeah, who are these guys? Who are these guys? And why have they been sitting here staring at me?
I don't want to
That's a
hijack the
really
show with
interesting
all my Flyers
Hey, Bill.
questions.
Oh, okay.
so did you have a welcome to the NHL moment your first year in the league?
In what sense? Welcome to the NHL
Like,
moment.
did you anything that happened on the ice? Like, I know, I think it was Joe Watson was saying his thing was getting knocked down by Bobby Hull, and just the interaction with Bobby Hull on the ice his first season in the league, and he said it was kind of like his welcome to the NHL moment. I was wondering if you had one of those.
Not really, because I knew a lot of the players in the NHL because I'd played junior against them. But um, that goal that I scored against Montreal, my second game in the NHL, uh, that was kind of that oh my God moment. I think I can play here, and I think I'm good enough to play here. And I was winning most of my face-offs. Um, I just people always ask me what was the key to winning a face-off, and I said was feeling like you were going to throw up if you lost it. Putting a high value on something like that. So my first game in Boston, yeah, I guess I did have a welcome to the NHL moment. And I get fan mail, still get fan mail from people saying, "Oh, Bobby Orr beat you in a fight." So my first game in Boston, I went into the corner with Bobby Orr and he butt ended me. He had about 6 inches. He butt ended me right in the ribs. And I thought, well, that ain't right. I got to do something about that. So I went in front of the net and gave him cross-checked him the chest, and we dropped our gloves. And I grabbed him and I threw one punch, and he went down. He went down and grabbed the back of my pants and just flipped me over, and landed on top of me. I remember hey, Bobby Orr beat you in a fight. What do you mean fight? I wanted to fight. He didn't want to fight, So and it's funny. A guy could have a broken jaw in a fight in the NHL, and if he lands on top, everybody thinks he won, right? They don't. Well, I mean, because you can't see who's getting hit and who doesn't when there's so many punches being thrown.
Yeah.
But after that, all of the Bruins were after me, and they would look at me, and Phil, they'd give me this one, like they always pointing at me, like we're gonna get you. We're going to get you. So I was never disappointed when the final buzzer went in a game against the Bruins, and they never did back it up. I mean, that they protected Bobby Orr, but I mean, it was a dirty play by him. butt ending was butt ending.
Hmm.
You didn't do that. So
Ed, question for Bill.
Bill, what was your favorite building to play in?
what building?
What was your favorite building to play in as a player?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you the ones that were hard for me to play in, first of all.
Sure.
The Buffalo Auditorium, the Olympia in Detroit, Boston Garden in Boston, because they were small. They weren't regulation size. And I had great straightaway speed. If the game was played on the St. Lawrence River in January, I I would have been an all-star every year but the agility issue on a really tiny rink. So those are the ones I didn't like playing in very much. But the rink that I seemed to really do well in was Madison Square Garden. I got more points on the road against the New York Rangers in Madison Square Garden than any other rink. So things just happened the right way for me there most of the time. So I always enjoyed going to New York and playing in Madison Square Garden. It wasn't like, hey, I'm in Madison Square Garden. It was just, I don't know, I felt comfortable there and picked up quite a few points there. So there was at least there's some reinforcement in my own memory banks to fall back on when we play there. And well, always our Atlanta team did really well in New York too. So did the Flyers. So yeah, Madison Square Garden, I'd say.
So, Bill, before we move on from Flyers questions to Washington Capitals questions, I want to ask you
Oh, do we
everybody.
have to? Do we
Well,
have to?
listen,
No, I'm okay.
uh,
Go ahead.
I gotta ask you every time that we've had somebody on, Joe Watson, Andre, everybody when they talk about Bernie Perrant, they have to
Yep.
do the accent, which you guys are spot on with the accent. And I always ask, what is your favorite Bernie Perrant story?
My favorite Bernie Perrant story is in that 1-0 Game 6 Stanley Cup 1 victory. Me taking a face-off to Bernie's left with about, I don't know, 5 to 7 minutes to go in the third period. I'm just getting ready to step in for the face-off. And I hear, hey, wait a minute. Hey, Billy, come here. And the linesman honored a request when a goalie wanted to talk to, the center. Like it's going to be it's going to be a strategic conversation. So, hey, Billy, come here. So I go, what's up, Benny? He says, how's she going? I said, what? He says, how's she going? I said, it's going pretty good. How are you? Good, good. Back and won the face off. And I don't know if Bernie was trying to relax me or him, you know, but it was a non-conversation, how's it going? It's pretty good. We got a 1-0 lead, Boston Bruins. We're going to win the Stanley Cup. How are you doing? You know, how are you doing? So, yeah, Bernie was always so funny and fun-loving. He was great to be around all the time. He and I had this thing in warm-up, when guys would start taking shots on him as they move in a little bit, sort of half moon, puck coming out of the corner, take a shot, puck coming out of the corner, take a shot. I would take a shot on Bernie, and I said I had an adequate shot. I didn't have a really good shot, but I had an adequate shot, enough, to score a few goals. And I'd take a big slap shot, and as I was making on impact of the puck, I would open my blade up, so it was almost like a sand wedge in golf. And I'd actually go under the puck, full motion, like a pitcher throwing a change up with full fastball motion, and the puck would just flutter into Bernie, and he waited for it every warm up. I'd shoot one puck like that, and we would both laugh. I don't think anybody else knew what the hell we were doing except Bernie and me, But Bernie was always so fun loving, so wonderful to be around. Almost, I almost thought he didn't know how to be angry, at anything or anybody. Just a great attitude all the time, man.
I before we move on with the trade, I got to ask you about one more player. I always
Yeah.
always do. Got to ask you favorite Bobby Clark story.
Famous Bobby Clark story?
Oh, your favorite.
There are almost too many. his display of leadership. So my favorite personal story about Bobby Clarke has to do with that first year we won the Cup. When we were playing against the Rangers, we were at practice one day, and Freddie Shero had us doing these combat drills where one guy would stand in front of the net trying to deflect shots from the blue line, and he would always tell the guys that shot from the blue line keep it flat on the ice. And two guys without their sticks, because he didn't want anybody getting really hurt, would jostle you from the side and rough you up. So I had Dave Schultz on one side and Don Selesky on the other side. And the last shot was coming, and Schultz pushed me, and I fell, and he landed on top of my leg that was outstretched, and I had a partially torn medial collateral ligament on my right knee. And I got up and tried to skate, and I went, oh, shit. Come on, man. So I went to see, I had to go to the doctor's office, and he put a cast on me. That's what they did back then. They don't do that today, but they put a cast on me from my groin down to my ankle. So I was straight-legged. And so I missed the last 3 games, I guess, or 4 games of the Rangers series. And I was in and out of the lineup anyway. I told guys at our recent charity weekend that we had as Flyers alumni, they said, what was Freddie Shero like? Well, I said, let me tell you this. He made me a healthy scratch 39 times one year, and I still loved him. So that's how much we cared, about Freddie. So I don't know. I wasn't eligible medically to play against the Rangers. And then we started against the Bruins, and those first 2 games happened, right? We lost the first one with 22 seconds to go. We won the second one with 51 seconds to go. I didn't play in those games. I'm still in the cast. So I'm watching, and I remember saying to myself, I got to see if I can play. I have to see if I can play. So we got back that night. That very next morning, first thing, I went to Dr. John Wolf's office, and I said, Wolfie, take this cast off. I want to see if I can play. And he said, you're not ready. You're supposed to be in the cast 3 weeks. It hasn't even been to 2 weeks. I said, I got to see if I can play. So he cut the cast off, and I hopped down off the table onto it, and it felt like a 10,000 volt bolt of lightning went through my heel all the way at the top of my head. It was, I can't remember feeling that much pain any time before. And I said, well, okay. I went down to the Spectrum, and I put skates on. I tried to skate, and that was a mistake. And I couldn't play game 3. I tried to skate on the off day before game 4 and couldn't, and just limping around. And finally, for game 4, the day of game 4, our trainer, Frank Lewis, said, don't even bother trying to skate. He said, come into the whirlpool tonight for the game and just make sure you can get some flexion back. I couldn't bend my leg past 90 degrees. And so I was sitting in the whirlpool before game 4, and Bobby Clarke came in and sat down beside the whirlpool, and he said, how is it? And I said, it's not very good. And he said, I got to tell you something. I said, what's that? He said, I'm not sure we can win this thing without you. And I went, what? He said, because Gary Dornhofer had suffered a separated shoulder. Barry Ashby had lost an eye. We had another starter that was damaged enough. Bob Kelly had a knee injury as well. He couldn't play. I was number 4 off our roster. And he said, even if you can just kill penalties, the guys we got called up from the minors can't do what you can do. So he said, I don't want you to jeopardize your career, but I want you to know when you're ready to come back, we're sure ready to have you back. And that's when the wheels started turning, and I thought, I got to try this. And anybody that can make you feel that you're vital to the outcome of anything will inspire you. And that's what Bobby Clarke did for me. I jumped out of the whirlpool, dried off. I told our trainer, Frank, I said, hey, tape my knee up any way you can, any way you know how. I got to take the warm up. So I went out and took the warm up, and I felt I felt like I was I was skating around with 2 neon signs in my body, one on my back that said one-legged man, and one that was flashing on and off on my knee saying, hit him here, hit him here, hit him here. And I came up the tunnel to the locker room, and there's our trainer, Frank Lewis, standing there. And he said, well, can you go? And my brain screamed at him, not a chance. And my lips went, yes. And I killed penalties in game 4. I played a little more in game 5. I got our only goal. We lost 5-1, and then I came back, and I was really happy with my performance. We all put our best performances together for game 6. But if I hadn't been made to feel that I was important and that I was absolutely vital to the outcome, to this day, I'm not sure I would have been in any of those games. Not sure. But that's Bobby Clarke at a young age. I think Bobby was 20. He was 24 when we won our first cup, or 23, and I was 22 or 23. Bobby was able to have what I call the tough conversation. In the business world, the greatest failing of all management people, all leaders, is the ability to have the tough conversation. And Bobby, if you weren't doing it, he'd say, you can play better. What's going on? Like, why aren't you playing as well as you can play? Is there anything we can do to help you with this? But we need more from you. That's a lot to look in a teammate's eyes and to tell them that when you're only 24. Some of the guys you're talking to are 30. But that was Bobby Clarke. He always had the courage and the wherewithal to have the tough conversation. And he knew when to pull, and he knew when to nail you with something. That game 5 where we lost in Boston, and it could have been 10-1, 10-0. Ricky McLeish was going through the motions, and God rest his soul, he was a great player, but his engine didn't run hot all the time. And it used to really bug those of us who were workaholics. It used to bug us. But Ricky was so talented, man. 50 goals one year. He was such a graceful player. That game in Boston in game 5, Ricky was going through the motions, and I was sitting beside Clarkey, and he was chewing his gum, and he's swearing at Ricky under his breath. Son of a... So Ricky got off the ice after one shift where he was kind of just, floated, going through the motions out there. And he sat down, and he actually sat down between Clarkey and me. And the 3 of us were the only 3 people that ever heard this. Clarkey, and I wrote about it in my book, Clarkey leaned over in front of me and said to Ricky, hey, Ricky, I sure hope you're saving it for Thursday night, you son of a bitch. And then sat back up, never said another word. Ricky McLeish got our only goal in that 1-0 win and was one of the best players on the ice the entire game. Bobby had the courage and the wisdom to say what needed to be said, sometimes with very few words, like he did that night with Ricky. And that, as a player, there wasn't anything about Bobby Clarke that didn't command or demand respect. His work ethic, his guts, his courage. What always bothered me, and I've had 100 other guys tell me this over the years. You know what bothered me about Clarkey when he played with you guys in Philadelphia? He let everybody else do his fighting. I said, you got this wrong. He didn't let anybody do his fighting. Nobody wanted him to do his fighting. They would jump in to try to make sure that he was protected. And I remember reading couple of books on the Civil War. Robert E. Lee, who was the head of the Confederate Army, he used to try to lead his troops into battle with his horse, get in front of the line. And his men would put their shoulders on his horse and turn him around and escort him to the back so that nothing would happen to him. And that was what it was with Clarkey. We loved him so much. He was so respected. Clarkey would have fought anybody to the death if he'd had to, but he never had to because there were other guys that wouldn't let him. Don Schultz, Bob Kelly, Moose Dupont, Dave Schultz, Don Selesky, all of us. We were one for all and all for one. So and I always tell guys, you're wrong about Clarkey. He would have fought till he was dead if he had to, but he didn't have to.
So, Bill, we're gonna shift gears and talk about how the trade happened. How did you leave our Philadelphia Flyers for the greener pastures of the Washington Capitals? Tell us how it
I
all went down.
I drew the short straw, that's for sure. Uh, so there was talk. There was an article in the Buffalo paper, in the newspaper, the Buffalo Tribune, I guess it is, before Game 6, that said one of either Dave Schultz, Bob Kelly, Terry Chris, Bill Clement, Don Selesky, 6 names. One or more than one of those names is going to end up being traded to the Washington Capitals. So I read that and I went, we won. And I didn't think anything of it. And I was driving home from Philadelphia to Ottawa, where I lived. My first wife lived in Ottawa, and we stayed with her family. We didn't make enough money to own a home anywhere, other than maybe a little cottage on a lake in Canada. We were making 16 grand or 18 or $22,000, whatever it was. And I stayed at my wife's aunt's house in Syracuse. Then I was in bed, and they had a pull-out couch, so I was sleeping on a pull-out couch. And about 7:30 in the morning, I hear there's a knock on the door, and I said, "Yeah, what's going on?" It was Margie. It was Aunt Margie, and she said, "Keith Allen's on the phone, and he'd like to speak with you." And I remember sitting straight up in bed, going, "Uh-oh." I knew what this call was going to be about, and he was very polite, very respectful. He said, "Tough decision. We have to make tough decisions. And you are going with a minor league defenseman named Don McLean. And our first pick, which was, I guess, 14th overall, we were the last pick in the first round. And we're trading you for the number 1 pick in the draft because they wanted to draft Mel Bridgman, 1 overall. And that was the beginning of 53 of the longest games of my life. Expansion teams teams were allowed to protect 18 skaters and 2 goalies. So an expansion team was just getting leftovers, right? Not like today. You're only allowed to protect like 7 or 8 players, 9 players, but you can only lose 1 player in the draft, the way expansion drafts work today. So like when Vegas came into the league and the Kraken in Seattle, they got good players, a lot of good players. So we had just a horrible team. And I remember driving around that summer. They wanted me in Washington right away to go on the chicken, potatoes, and peas circuit, going to Rotary clubs. They were trying to sell tickets any way they could, right? They're a brand new team, and I got that. I was driving along with the president of our team, Peter O'Malley, and we're driving, and he says, we want to fill this team with guys just like you Flyers players, guys that just love winning. And it was the first and only time it ever dawned on me. First time it dawned on me, and like a light went off. I had this great epiphany, and I looked at him and said, "Peter, can I make a suggestion?" He said, "Sure, what?" I said, "I'm going to suggest you try to fill this team full of players that hate losing, because everybody loves to win, but not everybody hates to lose. That's how you win championships, by having enough players on your roster that hate to lose." So that's how it started for me in Washington. They made me captain. And partway through the season, I played in the All-Star game, my first of 2 All-Star games representing Washington. And the day I got traded, we had just played our 21st game in a row that night before without a win. And it was mid-season, but we went through a stretch of 21 games without a win. And I remember Tommy McVie was our coach, and Tommy used to I made the mistake when they fired Milt Schmidt partway through the season, and they brought in Tommy McVie as a coach and Max McNabb as the general manager. And they called me in on the road in their hotel room, and they said, "Look, we got a question for you." I said, "What's that?" "Is our team as bad as our record?" I said, "I don't think so." And they said, "What can we do differently?" I said, "We're not in shape. I mean, what we give away in the tangible skills and stuff like that, we got to make up with things that we can control, like our own conditioning." Well, that was the wrong thing to tell Tommy McVie. He was a workaholic, and he was his favorite athlete was Steve Prefontaine, a middle distance runner in Portland, Oregon. And when Tommy played in the minors there, he used to watch him train. And Steve Prefontaine would train to exhaustion, run around the track, fall down, get up, do another 3 laps, fall down again. That's the way Tommy That's the way Tommy practiced us. It went from not being in shape to not having anything left for the games, because day of game, he would kill us like that. So I played in the All-Star game on a Monday night in Philadelphia, went out for a couple of pops with I still had great friends there. It was my first year away. And then I drove back to Washington, 2.5 hours to my house, and got a few hours sleep, then got up, went to practice, and Tommy, the day of the game, our morning skate would be like a full practice, full equipment, full everything. We lost to the New York Rangers on that Tuesday night by a goal. So I had played Monday night in Philly in the All-Star game, Tuesday night in Washington against the Rangers, and then our practice the next day, Tommy just beat us into the ground. And I went out after that home game against the Rangers. All my friends on our Washington team said, "What was it like, man? What was it? What was it like at the All-Star game?" So I got to bed pretty late that night, and Tommy killed us in practice. And he says to me after practice, "Max wants to see you." So I had to go all the way from Tyson's Corner, Virginia, and drive back around the Beltway. That first year, our practice rink was in Tyson's Corner, Virginia. We were called the Washington Capitals, and our rink was in Landover, Maryland. So we were driving all over the place all the time. So I drove back to Max's office at the arena, and he's sitting there, and he said, "Good game last night." I said, "Yeah." I said, "We're going to bust this." He said, we should have won that game against the Rangers." And he takes a big bite of hamburger, and he said, "Well, we had to make some changes, and it's a good one for you. Atlanta, here, Cliff Fletcher wants to talk to you." And he picks up his phone on the desk and hands me the phone, just like that, while he was still chewing and swallowing his hamburger. And the first thing I thought was, please, God, tell me there's not a game tonight that they want me to play in. Sure enough, Cliff said, "We've been trying to trade for you for 2 years now. And finally, when you got to Washington, you're not in the same conference as we are. So Washington was willing to trade with us." And he said, "We're playing in Philadelphia tonight. We need you." I said, I can't. I mean, like, is there a way around this? He said, we traded 2 players off our roster and a first round pick to get you. They traded Jerry Meehan, a defenseman named Jean Lemieux, and a first round pick for me. And he said, "We got holes in our lineup because those 2 guys are out now. We really need you tonight." So I drove back to Philadelphia. I think we got smoked 7-2, and it was a blur. I slept on the charter flight home and then slept all day the next day. And then I got 2 goals the next game for Atlanta, playing against Buffalo, and started on a new trajectory. And 2 years after that, I played in another All-Star game. What's really interesting about my career that I try to help like young athletes understand. I've been asked many times, are scorers born or are they made? And I said, well, the great scorers are born, right? Like the 50-goal scorers and Wayne Gretzky. The greats are born. That doesn't mean you can't improve. But I also believe that non-scorers can be made. And I was the perfect example of that. Those 4 years of junior, the 1 full year in the American League as a pro, I never scored 20 goals. And I had 3 20-goal seasons in the NHL. So I tell everybody, find ways to improve. Every day, try to do something to improve what you want to improve in. And in Atlanta, it just really worked. We couldn't win a playoff game to save our lives, but man, did we have good regular season teams. Biggest team in the league. So by the time I was angry at Washington. The owner was Abe Poland, who also owned the Washington Bullets basketball team. And I remember Max, after I handed him his phone back and wanted to say, "Go ahead and eat your freaking hamburger, Max." He said, can you spare a couple of minutes for Abe Poland, our owner? He wants to see you." And I said, "Well, I guess I can give him 2 minutes. That's about as much of his time as he's given me since I've been here. I don't even think I ever met him." So I went to Abe Poland's office with Max, and I went in by myself to see Abe Poland. And he was the most gracious, complimentary, thankful man. Just said, "I really want to thank you. And I've watched you play, and we're trying to improve our team." So he did it right. You know what I mean? He just did it right. There's a way to do it, and there's a way not to do it. And I'm just thinking, who the heck coached the Washington Redskins? That
Joe
the
Gibbs?
future is now NFL coach. Oh God, his name escapes me. But in Philadelphia at the All-Star game, at the big banquet, the All-Star banquet the night before the game, he came up to me and said, the Capitals had traded away the number 1 overall pick to get me. And he said, future's now, man. I'm glad they made that deal. I'm glad we got you here. Draft picks can't do anything for you right away. So I'm glad we got you in Washington. And of course, 2 days later, I was traded out of there. Yeah, those crazy times, man.
Tom,
Atlanta was great though.
before we get into the Atlanta stuff, Tom, do you have a question for Bill?
Well, yeah, this is a general over your whole career. What line mate do you think you had the best chemistry with?
Well, we were 1-2 in scoring, or 1-2-3 in scoring at Christmas in Atlanta. A big, tough, strong left winger named Harold Filipoff that was part of a 7-8 player deal with Chicago and got traded away. But I played with him and a winger named John Gould, and the three of us, we really clicked. We had Tom Lysiak. In Washington, I was our number 1 center, but it's because we didn't have a number 1 center. I really, would have been classified as a number 2, maybe number 3 center. But by the time I was in Atlanta, my confidence had grown, and I was a legit number two center in the league. And Tommy was, I miss him. He passed away a few years ago of leukemia. But Harold Filipoff and John Gould in Philadelphia, I was one of probably, we had 3 set lines, and then there was the mix of myself, Bob Kelly, Terry Crisp, well, the 3 set lines were Bobby Clark's line, right, with Bill Flett the first year, then Reggie Leach, Billy Barber. Then there was McLeish, Dornhofer, Lonsberry, Kenner, Chuck Schultz, and Selesky. And in the 4th line, teams only played 3 lines. The 4 lines that teams play now, that was unheard of. So we would mix in and out of the lineup, Bob Kelly or Terry Crisp or myself most of the time. So I never really had regular wingers until I moved on to Washington and then to Atlanta. So my best wingers were irregular. I didn't have any regular line mates in Philly.
Ed, question for Bill?
Sure. Bill, who was the toughest player you played against?
Well, I'll tell you the toughest player for 5 years in the league, Dave Schultz, was the baddest animal in the hockey jungle. I can tell you that. The best fighters, probably Ben Wilson of the Flyers after I was there. And he is still spoken about by the other tough guys as being the best, the toughest guy. But I never really saw that because in Atlanta, I played with a guy named Willie Plett, Plett. And Willie was a big, tough guy of German descent with his blonde hair. I wear a double XL golf glove. He wears a triple XL golf glove. And I saw Willie get blindsided, be in a fight, and have guys that come in. And Ben Wilson sucker punched him from the side, and Willie just threw down, I forget who he was fighting, and grabbed Ben and won that bit too. So he was, Willie Plett was really tough. And the Bruins had, when they were in their heyday, they were as tough as the Broad Street Bullies. They had Terry O'Reilly and Stan Jonathan and John Wensink, whose nickname was Wire because he was wired. I mean, and Al Secord in his prime. So boy, they had a really, really tough teams in Boston all the time. But I said, talking to other tough guys in that era, Ben Wilson was the toughest, and even Clark Gillies and Bobby Nystrom with the New York Islanders, they share the same stories about Ben Wilson. So the Flyers had a series of guys come through. Now, after I retired, the baddest animal in the hockey jungle for a number of years was Dave Brown. And Dave Brown could fight because, a lot of guys throw big roundhouses, when they get into a hockey fight, they're just throwing from back here. Brownie threw from here, straight, all the time, and really enjoyed it. I was doing Flyers television the year Billy Dineen was coaching the Flyers, and they were going through lean times, missing the playoffs. And The Islanders' tough guy was Ken Baumgartner. And the Flyers had a player out of college named Brad Jones who had a cracked jaw, so he had a helmet on with a jaw piece. And I'm calling the game, and at the end of the second period, and Brad Jones was a college player, so he wasn't a real tough kid. But Kenny Baumgartner dropped his gloves and grabbed the jaw piece and then lifted it up and just beat the hell out of Brad Jones. And I didn't find this out till a few days later, but on a team bus, and the broadcasters would travel on a team bus. And I ended up sitting beside Billy Dineen. And Billy Dineen said, I said, yeah, how about that game the other night, the Islanders? And he said, yeah, Brownie, as soon as that happened with Brad Jones and Ken Baumgartner, he said, Brownie turned around and said to me, I only need one shift against him, against Baumgartner. And third period started. As soon as Baumgartner hit the ice, here comes Brownie. Hit him so hard, broke his cheekbone, his orbital bone, the bone that supports the eyeball, and cut him under here. And Baumgartner was out of the lineup, I think, for at least 6 weeks. But the tough guys like that knew their role and it's funny, I've told people over the years that term enforcer in hockey, for the guy that does all the fighting, or the guys that do all the fighting, I said they're called that for a real specific reason, because they enforce a code of conduct on the ice. That's what I think the enforcers always did best. You got 150-pound, 160-pound players playing against 230-pound players in the same areas of the ice. And the refs can't legislate against a big guy hitting a little guy. You can't give a guy a penalty just because the other guy that he hit and killed was smaller than him. So that's when the tough guys would say, don't touch him, don't hit him like that. I'm coming for you. If you hit him like that again, I'm coming for you. And boy, it enforced a code of conduct. It was pretty effective because, yeah, guys were all afraid of being made an idiot of, or being dragged around in front of 20,000 people, and losing a fight like that. So the enforcers did their job really well.
Bill, I got to ask you about the Atlanta Flames. Now, for people that don't remember that time, they probably don't even remember that Atlanta had a team 2 other times. But let's talk about the Flames, talk about the culture, and maybe a story that hockey fans wouldn't even know about the Atlanta Flames.
Well, first of all, we averaged 10,000 people a game. We didn't fail in Atlanta. Our owner saw an opportunity, and he was a real estate developer and a classy man, Tom Cousins. He saw an opportunity to recover some of his losses in real estate and kind of move on from the sports ownership business. So he made a bunch of money when he sold it to a guy named Nelson Scalbania, and we ended up moving to Calgary. Our Atlanta team, and it was always for me about team. Our Atlanta team, we had more funny guys on that team than any other team that I played on, and I was kind of a class clown. That's why I got kicked out of a lot of classrooms, when I was younger. But Atlanta was a wonderful time for me. I loved the city. I loved the South. When that expression "living is easy in the South," it's really true. Everybody was so friendly. Everybody was so wonderful. Yeah, nothing stands out hockey-wise. I mean, I know we had bench emptying brawl against the Flyers, and that was crazy. And people that watch hockey today, they don't even know what a bench emptying brawl looks like, because they've legislated so heavily against that. And I know why, but in the day, when 20 guys would pair up, and believe me when I tell you, there weren't enough sheriffs on the ice to go around for the number of outlaws that were out there. And it was like a street fight going on. So I always remember our guys, our Atlanta team did really well. We had such a huge team. And I remember what started that brawl was my third goal. I got a hat trick. Bobby Taylor was in goal, and I got a hat trick against the Flyers. And I came back to the bench, and I don't know who I was sitting beside, but we had a little center named Ray Como, French kid, and nice guy. And he goes out for the face-off at center after I scored my hat trick goal. And I remember saying to nobody in particular, "Watch Clarkie." puck was dropped, Clark came right up and speared Ray underneath the chin like that and just laid him out. And that's when the bench is emptied right then. And I think we won easily. We won that game easily against the Flyers. But I knew it was going to happen as soon as I got that third goal. I'm kind of glad they didn't leave me on the ice. I mean, that could have been me. I don't think Clarky probably wouldn't have done that to me. We were teammates on Cup winners, but that's how brawls would start. Somebody would deliver like a real potentially lethal blow. And I remember when Clarky got hit over the head by what's his first name from Oakland, Barry Cummings. He popped Bobby on the top of the head and cut him open. So Clarky had blood all over his face. Clarky loved that. When it would blood, I always figured he loved that. But it happened right near our bench. Boom. Freddie Shero gave the Hound, Bob Kelly, the biggest wedgie. He grabbed him by the back of his hockey pants and threw him over the boards. Like, go get him, Hound Dog. And that was a violent game too against Oakland. There was so many of those. Don't plan anything for 10 o'clock the day of a game, because some of the games wouldn't end till after 11, for a 7 or 8 o'clock start. Yeah, it was really an interesting era to play through, that time. And it's cleaned up. So in so many ways, the game is better now, but in so many ways, every game looks the same to me. The coaching has become so sophisticated. Every team has 8 or 9 or 10 coaches. They're all their statistical guys, their analytics guys, their strength coach, their penalty killing coach, their power play coach, their goaltending coach, maybe 15 guys. And it's become so scientific. But at times for me, it's like watching people paint by numbers instead of having artists out there. Even Connor McDavid was rendered kind of not visible. You know what I mean? And how does that happen? Florida was well coached and well disciplined, and they had good defensive players. But other than a Connor McDavid and the odd player here and there, for me the games look the same. They really do. And I think that's the evolution of the sport. That's just the way it's evolved. I like the old days. For me, the most exciting games are when they're a 2-on-1 at one end and a 3-on-2 going the other way, and with no mistakes, those plays don't happen.
Yep.
So the perfect game now is you don't give a breakaway a 2-on-1 or an outnumbered situation like a 3-on-2. But that's to me that's what would really get the crowd buzzing when those plays would happen.
Bill, I got to ask you about the transition from hockey to the microphone, and how did that all come about?
Wow. Well, my first venture out of the NHL was restaurant franchising. I wanted to move back to Atlanta, and I acquired the rights for a Canadian restaurant franchise, a bakery deli franchise called Grandma Lee's Bakery and Deli. And I'd worked a few days in one of their stores in Calgary because I'd been asked by 2 friends to raise money for them because they bought the rights for 4 Western states. I liked what I saw. I acquired the rights. Trying to find the first location was where I could open up was really difficult. And what I hadn't realized was Atlanta had more food and beverage establishments per capita than any city in North America. And it wouldn't have made a difference. I was committed to it. But 2.5 years after I retired, I lost everything. Lost my home. My marriage fell apart. My second marriage. I was broke. I was depressed. I had no job, no career, no education, no college degree. And during that first year, when I had real estate agents combing the area for the right location, I realized at one point that I'd gone a year without a paycheck. And that didn't feel right. So I said to myself, what might I have an aptitude for that could be financially rewarding and not time consuming? That's the American dream, right? Make money, not have to work too hard for it. So I thought, I think I could do a television commercial as well as some of these people that I see on TV. So I got one of my teammates, his wife, Kurt Bennett's wife, Susan, who I found out years later was the voice of Siri. She was a performer and a singer, and she got me a go-see with one of the agents in Atlanta that she had. And they sent me on a couple of auditions, and I actually landed 3 spots that first year. And so when the bottom fell out and I filed bankruptcy, I decided to go full time into acting. And I enrolled in the Alliance Theater School in Atlanta, and I took every class that they had available. And I got reasonably good at it. I met my third wife. We just celebrated our 39th anniversary, so we got it right the third time. At least I did. Uh, we were paired up to read as husband and wife on a National Blue Cross Blue Shield commercial audition. That's how we met. So life imitated art, and we were scouted by talent scouts in New York and told, "Come on, move to New York." So I wasn't about to assume I was good enough, or that my future wife was good enough to be in New York. So we went and asked our agents, "Are we good enough to compete in New York?" And they said, "We think so." So I left everything. I cut all ties to Atlanta, loaded up a truck, or big U-Haul truck, rented a little apartment in Queens, and started auditioning, and things went well in New York. And the phone rang one day, and it was ESPN. And they said, "Brad Park has left to go back to coach the Detroit Red Wings. Would you be interested in auditioning for one of our jobs as color analyst? Because we have 2 of them, and one of them's gone." And the thought of a regular paycheck as opposed to auditioning for my lunch and my rent every week and every month kind of appealed. There was a broad appeal to that concept. So I said, "Yes, what does the audition consist of?" And they said, "A live game on the air. We're going to put you in the seat for a live game." So they sent me to Chicago, in the Chicago Stadium, to do a Minnesota North Stars Chicago Blackhawks game. And there were 4 other guys that did their games, and they liked my audition, my game, and I became an analyst. And my acting career kind of went like this, as my broadcasting career was going like that. And it all worked out. But I know that I had to take chances, and step out on the ledge. I try to tell people that on TV or actors or anybody, if you're not willing to step out onto the ledge once in a while, you'll probably end up as a slice of white bread on the sandwich of life for the rest of the years, if you're not willing to, get out on the tightrope. And that's why the cover of my book is me crossing in a business suit, crossing Grand Canyon on a tightrope. You can Google it anytime you want. You'll see it. It's a pretty cool cover. But that it represents something to me, stepping out on that tightrope, because I had to do it when I left home when I was 15. My mom and dad took a lot of criticism from friends, but they said, "No, we thought you were mature enough and that you were going to keep going to school," which I did. And but it was scary, man. I was the youngest player in the Quebec League. Gilbert Perreault was the second youngest player that year in the Quebec League. But if you're not willing to take chances, don't let the adrenaline flow and the fear turn you back and retreat, because you'll never be successful. So there's symbolism at me crossing that tightrope on the cover of my book.
Bill, about the book, can people get a hold of you or mail for a copy of the book or a signed copy if they want to get a hold of you?
I used to do signed copies, but I don't any longer. But they can always. Well, here's my address. No, I get so much fan mail as it is. I mean, you can't hide anymore, but it's still, Amazon's still selling it. It's called
Nice.
Everyday Leadership: Crossing Gorges on Tightropes to Success.
Bill,
Yeah.
I gotta share a funny story about the off commercial. Now, when that commercial came on as a kid for me, my mother loved that commercial for obvious reasons. And I told her who it was in the commercial, and she didn't believe me that I actually had to run and get my hockey card and show her
Yeah.
who it was, because when it would come on, she was like, "Oh, that's the guy. That's who I told you it was." So
Yeah.
funny off commercial with the Clark household and my mother enjoying your commercial. We'll just say that.
We filled this tent with 10,000 hungry mosquitoes and biting flies, but they're
Yep.
not biting me. I'm using Deep Woods Off, repels extra tough mosquitoes and biting flies. I still remember the copy. That
I,
was shot in 1987. What's really
right.
interesting is that I auditioned. I was working on ESPN, and I still was hitting, decent auditions in New York. So I auditioned for this, and they wanted me to go to a call. They audition almost every guy in New York, and the process usually involves starting with a group of, I don't know, 60, 80, 100, 200 actors, narrowing it down on the first call back to maybe 25, and then a third call back, depending on how wide the field is, to maybe the 5 best guys. So I was broadcasting the Flyers and the Rangers series on ESPN. I couldn't make the first call back. I couldn't make the second call back. Then I get a call one day saying, you got the job. And that never happened. The reason you have callbacks, especially that last callback, whoever is going to direct the commercial is there at the audition. And they want to make sure that you have enough range to take direction, right? It's one thing to deliver it the way you want to deliver it, but what happens if the director wants a little different deal? So I said, how did I get the job? But I had a complication. They wanted me down in Orlando to drive out into the Everglades on a Wednesday night. I had a Tuesday game in Philadelphia, a Thursday game in New York, Flyers Rangers. It was early in their series. And I said to our producer, the late Bruce Connell, who was wonderful, died way too young. I said, what about this? He said, we'll get you back to New York somehow on that Thursday. Do what you got to do. So I flew to Orlando, and I've got some kind of food poisoning or something. But I walked into the little restaurant. I got there, got a 6 a.m. flight, got there about 8:30, and there were 3 women and 3 men having breakfast, and I figured these are the people. And I said, I don't feel very good. And they said, well, why don't you go up to your room, get a couple hours sleep, and give us a call when you get up. I said, okay. So I called them, and they said, can we come to your room? I said, okay. So like 5 of them show up in my hotel room, and they're sitting around and making wee little small talk. And I'm thinking, what the hell are y'all doing here? Right? So they introduced me to the director, and he said, are you off book? Meaning, have you memorized your lines? And then I had to do 30 seconds from top to bottom. There were no pickup points in this, which is most of the time you can do 8 seconds, and then there's a camera angle change, and you can just go for the next 5 seconds or whatever. This was 30 seconds. And he said, are you off book? And I said, yeah. And he said, do you want to run through it? I said, sure. We filled this tent with 10,000 hungry mosquitoes and biting flies, but they're not biting me. I'm wearing Deepwood's off. Repels extra tough mosquitoes. He said, okay, can you, we need it a little more authoritative, and we want you to be almost severe in, can you do one of those? And I said, we filled this tent with 10,000 hungry mosquitoes and biting flies, and they're not biting me, so, and they all went, oh. So they knew that I could give them what they wanted as long as they gave me the right direction. And it turned out that there were 2 women, one from Johnson & Johnson and one from the advertising agency, that wanted me in the commercial. And the director and the producer were both men. And they said, we can't take him unless we get in it. And the women won and said, no, we really want him in the commercial. So that was going on behind the scenes. I had no idea how I got the commercial, not being able to make either one of the 2 callbacks. And that was a $150,000 payday, as it turned out. I kept getting checks in the mail, and I said, this is a beautiful country. What a concept, what a country.
And a lot of people don't remember that you actually went back and did the commercial again years later.
Many years later. Yeah. I needed to try to tone up because I was just wearing a pair of shorts. That was the whole key to the commercial. I was in the tent wearing just a pair of shorts and a pair of shoes and sneakers, hiking sneakers. That was the whole key. And yeah, the repellent got way better the second time, like 15 years later, 19. I mean, I got bit twice in that first commercial. That was way back. Yeah. And it burnt my skin too. I mean, it was so full of DEET. You can't beat the DEET in today's off deep woods. That was the second one that I did years later. You can't beat the DEET. Whatever.
Tom, you got to have a question for Bill before we start wrapping it up.
Yeah. What do you want your legacy to be known as a player?
Oh, as a player, as a player, there are only two things somebody could accuse me of that would really hurt me. If they said he wasn't a good team guy and he didn't work hard. I place such a great importance on group endeavors, and I try to work as hard. I always tried to work as hard as I could. And so those two things were important to me, that he was a good teammate and that we always counted on him to give us everything that he had. There was nothing. It's funny, after I retired, I missed that feeling of being completely exhausted after a game, and even waking up the next morning, like not being able to move, like your shoulder or part of you that didn't work just right. It was actually reminiscent of why I played, and what I wanted to do was like play as hard as I could and win all the time. So those are the two things. I want my legacy to be, when somebody that knows me, that played against me or played with me, he worked really hard and he cared about his teammates.
Ed, question for Bill so we can wrap it up.
Absolutely. What made the chemistry between you and Gary so great on on screen during the broadcast? Because I know,
Gary Thorne.
yes,
Yeah. Well, first of all, we never rehearsed anything. Gary's incredibly quick on his feet. I always prided myself on being quick on my feet. And, just having the first 5 games I ever worked in the booth, I worked with 5 different play-by-play guys. I worked in total with 33 different play-by-play guys throughout my career. And you have to really be able to anticipate and build. So being able to be quick on your feet and being able to be spontaneous and all of those things, I think, go into the great chemistry that any play-by-play and color analyst have together. And I think that if I don't know if Gary was sitting here now, he might say the same thing, possibly not. But Gary was first of all play-by-play guys. The most underrated element of every great play-by-play guy is their IQ, I think. They're really, really smart guys, like Doc Emmerich and Gary Thorne. I worked 7 years with Doc, and I worked more than that with Gary Thorne. And Jim Jackson, my last few years in Philadelphia, those 3 guys are all really, really smart people, and it really helps. And at some point, when you give yourself to the show, it's never about you. It's never about me. It's about the show, which means Gary and I had this conversation once. I said, neither one of us is ever going to be considered to be the best ever that did what they did, unless we are considered to be one of the best teams ever. And I think that holds true in any sport, the play-by-play guys and the color analysts. So Gary was, and Gary had the pipes too, man. Could he bring it? Oh, geez. So yeah, I think it's just putting the show first, and then caring about each about your partner being as good as they can be. And it's like anything else. Chemistry is a hard thing to explain.
it was
it just
fantastic,
works.
Bill.
Yeah. Thank you for that compliment. Yeah, Gary, I had. And it's funny, I was inducted into the Hall of Fame, the Hockey Hall of Fame. Was it 2022 already or 2023? And part of my acceptance speech was, I said, what's really unfair is that my name's going to go up here in my photo, and it's going to say, that I'm going into the Hall of Fame. I said, there's so many more people involved in somebody getting into the Hall of Fame. It's not just me. It's all the great play-by-play people I had. It's our executive producers, our producers, our directors, the people in the truck, the stage manager that helps you, in the booth and all of that stuff. And it still holds true. And Bobby Clark said this to a few years ago, and it was about playing against a star player in hockey. And he said, a great team will always beat a great player. And that's, I think, how I approached everything. And in a perfect world, the idealist in me says, in a perfect world, everybody would aspire to that same concept. The best team, a good team, a great team will always beat a great player. So I just tried to be a decent teammate. That's all.
Bill, I got to ask you, your favorite moment as a broadcaster.
Wow. There were so many incredible moments, so many. Um, the time that the time that Doc and I were working Game 7 of the Patrick Division round between Washington and the Islanders, when it went to 4 overtimes, and I took off my shirt and tied my tie around my head, might not have been my favorite moment, but it put me on the map. And if you want to talk about stepping out on the ledge, and Doc and I, we had nothing to fill with between periods. So we decided that, I thought I'll take a chance. We wanted to paint what was happening as kind of the Woodstock of hockey because it had never been done before. It was 4 overtimes. So we got messing around with it. And the big red telephone in the truck rang and said, tell him to put his shirt back on, get that tie off his head. And it's funny, the day after, Rudy Martzke was the TV columnist for USA Today. And our director of programming, a guy named Steve Bornstein, he ripped us in the papers, just ripped us. And the next day, Doc Emmerich and I each got a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne from the president of ESPN, Bill Grimes, saying, "Thanks for putting us on the map, man." But that's what I leaned on when I said, "Look, I've never tried and do it like that again." And it wasn't contrived; it was spontaneous. But that's for years, I had people saying, "When are you gonna put your tie around your head again? When are you gonna do that?" I said, "I don't know. Next time I call a 4 overtime game." So there's so many great moments. One of when the New York Rangers ended their curse, their 50-year curse, 50, 54-year, 50-year curse, I guess, at Madison Square Garden in Game 7, they win by a goal. They had that series against Vancouver 3-1. And then it went 3-2, 3-3, back to New York for the 7th game. And in the third period, Vancouver hit the post. Rangers had a 1-goal lead. Could have heard a pin drop in Madison Square Garden. People were so, can this really be happening? And there were so many great Flyers memories too. The J.J. Daigneault overtime goal, or I don't know if he tied it or won it in overtime. The spectrum was never louder than some of those. And Keith Primo's magical goal against the Tampa Bay Lightning in a monumental 7-game series against the Lightning. So there are no moments. I mean, there are series that just were bitter, hard fought, great players playing great hockey. I think I ended up calling. I know I called over 1,000 games. So to isolate one's really hard.
Like I said, when we started, the first time I talked to you on the phone, it was no BS from me to you. And these guys will agree. We've talked about it before on the podcast. The greatest hockey announce team of all time. No, no knock on Doc Emmerich, you and Gary Thorne. It's so generational for me in that bubble of being immersed in the hockey world, and you guys helped really immerse young people and fans into that whole culture. And that's no BS.
Thank you.
That's
That
straight
means
from me and the guys.
that means a lot to me. And I always broadcast, my whole objective was just to feed my family. I mean, I wanted to earn a good enough living to feed my family. And the fact that I was able to do it on a stage with a lot of people watching, and it means something to me. And I always wanted a fan watching to feel that they knew me, that I was approachable. I wanted to be a kind of a regular guy that knew something about the sport of hockey. And that's what I tried to be. And it apparently it worked. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate the kind remarks. It means a lot to me to say that, that you were watching when you were a kid and there I was, and that you remember it, and that I, did something important for you. It means a lot to me.
Now,
Thank you.
you not only being part of the Flyers family that you were, but that immersing through the 80s with me watching so much hockey. You figure 83, I was 10 years old. I was already watching hockey since 1980 with the 80 Olympics, and
Yeah.
all through and playing as a kid, and the hockey card collecting and the immersion, and going to the carnivals. And so it's huge for me to have you on the show. I really, really mean that. And from the guys too, we really appreciate it. And I always end with this question, Bill.
All right.
If you had to sum up your entire hockey journey with one word, what would it be?
Blessed. Blessed. Like I said, who knew that I was going to end up playing on 2 Stanley Cup winning teams? And we all gave what we could to that. So we all had a little piece of it. Some guys had bigger pieces of it, but we all had a little piece of it. And then to be able to broadcast and blessed. I grew up in that little French-speaking town, and my dad worked at the paper mill. And culturally, there wasn't anything going on in that little paper mill town. But within the 4 walls of my home, I grew up with 2 incredible parents. They encouraged me all the time, let me make my own mistakes, which is one of the great failures, I think, of parents in the world today. They don't want their kid to fail. I wouldn't have been able to achieve what I achieved unless I had gone through times of real adversity, and my parents let me fail. That's the biggest gift I was ever given by my parents, the gift to fail. And the fact that I was able to get back up on the horse and keep riding, I'm just blessed. Blessed. I mean, you can't pick your parents, right? So I'm
Correct.
blessed the whole day, the whole deal. I was really blessed.
Well, I just want on this Sunday morning, I'm going to let you go, but I want to tell you that we are blessed, and I'll say that from the 3 of us. Everybody that's come on the show, I'm super super happy to have them on. You're talking to actual hockey fans
Yeah.
that grew up watching you, immersed in the culture, played growing up. I've coached, my kids play, huge Flyers fan. So I am so happy to have you on a Sunday morning, joining us, telling stories, and being a part of the show, and hopefully a friend of the show going forward.
Yes, sir. Good luck to all you guys. Thanks for having me.
Bill,
Always love chatting hockey, especially with people that are really invested in not only the sport itself, but have a deep-seated curiosity about the answers to the questions that they're asking. And that's you guys. So thank you for having me.
Thank
Bill,
you, Bill.
thank you
I
so much for your
appreciate
time.
it. Everything. So
Okay, guys.
we'll kindly let you go, and you can enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, boys.
Thank
Great
you.
Take
talking
care,
with you.
man.
Truly blessed. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.